I bought a Queen's abandoned manor for £1, and what I found inside was worth more than gold. It was worth my freedom, my future, and a love I never believed a woman like me deserved. My name is Cecily Wentworth, and I was born in the winter of 1847, in a small cottage on the outskirts of Dorset, where the wind never seemed to stop howling through the cracks in the walls. My mother was a seamstress who worked her fingers raw to keep bread on our table, and my father was a clerk who died of consumption when I was 7 years old. I remember very little of him now, after all these years, except the smell of ink on his fingers and the way he would read to me by candlelight, his voice soft and reverent, as if the words themselves were sacred treasures meant to be handled with care. When he died, I watched my mother's face turn to stone. She took in more work after that, her fingers bleeding from the needle, her eyes dimming year by year until she too was taken from me when I was 14, leaving me alone in a world that had no patience for orphaned girls with nothing to offer. I had no dowry, no connections, no beauty that would make a man overlook my poverty and lack of prospects. What I had was a sharp mind, a talent for languages that my father had cultivated in those precious years before his death, and a desperate, clawing will to survive. And so, at 15 years of age, I became a governess. For 17 years, I moved through the great houses of England like a ghost, seen but never truly acknowledged, useful but never valued. I taught French and Latin to children who would grow up to inherit fortunes I could never imagine, who would marry into families whose names had graced the pages of history books for centuries. I corrected their posture, their grammar, their manners. I shaped them into proper young ladies and gentlemen who would take their rightful places in society. And I watched them forget my name within months of leaving their nurseries, as if I had never existed at all. I learned early in my career that a governess occupies a peculiar and painful place in the hierarchy of a great house. Too educated to eat with the servants in the kitchen, where they laughed and gossiped and formed bonds of friendship that I envied more than I could say. Too poor and common to dine with the family in the elegant dining room, where candlelight gleamed on silver and crystal and the conversation turned to matters far above my station. I took my meals alone in my room more often than not, staring at the walls while I chewed my cold meat and bread, and I told myself that solitude was a comfort rather than a punishment. I told myself many lies in those years, just to survive. The last family I served was the Pemberton household in Hampshire. Lord and Lady Pemberton lived in a sprawling estate called Whitmore Park, where the gardens stretched for miles and the house itself seemed to go on forever. Room after room filled with treasures accumulated over generations. Lady Pemberton was a kind woman, gentle and soft-spoken, who treated me with more warmth and respect than I had experienced in all my years of service. She asked my opinions on books and music. She inquired after my health when I looked tired. She remembered my birthday and gave me a pair of embroidered gloves that I still treasure to this day. Her 3 daughters adored me, and I adored them in return. Eleanor, the eldest, was studious and serious, with a mind that devoured knowledge the way other children devoured sweets. Margaret was artistic and dreamy, forever sketching pictures in the margins of her schoolbooks. And little Catherine, just 5 years old when I arrived, was pure sunshine given human form, with golden curls and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. For the first time in my long and lonely career, I allowed myself to imagine that I might stay somewhere permanently, that I might finally have found a place where I belonged. But Lady Pemberton fell ill in the autumn of 1878. A fever that would not break, a cough that rattled through the halls of Whitmore Park like a death knell, growing louder and more terrible with each passing day. The doctors came and went, their faces growing graver each time they emerged from her sick room. They bled her and dosed her with medicines that seemed to do nothing but cause her more suffering. I sat by her bedside when the family was too exhausted to continue their vigil, holding her thin hand in mine and reading to her from her favorite novels, the same stories she had once read to her daughters when they were small. I was there when she drew her last breath, just before dawn on a cold November morning, and I wept as I had not wept since my own mother died. Lord Pemberton, consumed by grief and rage at a world that had stolen his wife from him, dismissed the entire household staff within a fortnight of the funeral. He could not bear to look at us, he said, his voice hollow and his eyes red-rimmed with weeping. We reminded him too much of her, of the life they had built together, of everything he had lost. I understood his pain, even as I felt the ground crumbling beneath my feet. I was given a month's wages and a letter of reference, so brief and perfunctory it might as well have been blank paper. And just like that, at 32 years old, I was cast out into a world that had no place for women like me. I spent the winter of 1878 and 1879 in a boarding house in London, a cramped and dingy establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Dalton, watching my meager savings dwindle with each passing week. The room I rented was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The wallpaper was stained with damp, and the fireplace smoked so badly I could only light it on the coldest nights, when the alternative was freezing. I applied to every respectable household that advertised for a governess, writing letters until my hand cramped and my eyes burned. But my age worked against me at every turn. Families wanted young women, women who could be molded and controlled, women who had not yet developed opinions or expectations. I was too old at 32, too experienced, too much of a known quantity to be trusted with their precious children. By February, I had nearly resigned myself to seeking work as a lady's maid, or worse, a factory worker. I lay awake at night in that miserable little room, staring at the cracked ceiling while the sounds of the city filtered through the thin walls, and I wondered if this was how my story would end. Not with tragedy or drama, but with a slow, quiet fading into obscurity, a life of drudgery that would continue until my body gave out, and I was buried in some unmarked pauper's grave, forgotten by everyone who had ever known me. It was Mrs. Dalton who first told me about Ashford Hall. She was a gossip of the highest order, Mrs. Dalton, with a talent for collecting rumors and scandals, the way other women collected china figurines or pressed flowers. Nothing happened in London that she did not know about, and nothing delighted her more than sharing her knowledge with anyone who would listen. One evening in late February, as I sat alone in the shabby parlor of the boarding house, pretending to read a book while my mind spiraled into darker and darker places, she settled into the chair across from me with a cup of tea and a gleam in her eye that I had come to recognize. "Have you heard about the old manor up in Yorkshire?" she asked, leaning forward with barely contained excitement, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper she used when sharing particularly delicious information. "The one they say is haunted." I confessed that I had not, though my interest was only half-hearted. I had little energy for ghost stories when my own life felt like something of a horror tale. "Ashford Hall," she continued, undeterred by my lack of enthusiasm, "used to belong to a baron, years and years ago, back before you or I were born. Then the crown seized it for some reason, something to do with debts or treason or some such scandal. They say the Queen herself visited there once, back when she was younger, before Prince Albert died, and she went into all that mourning. But it has been empty for decades now, just sitting there on the moors, falling to pieces. No one will live there. Everyone who tries runs away within days, screaming about voices in the walls and shadows that move when they should not. The government has been trying to sell it for years, but no one will touch it." I listened with half an ear, assuming this was merely another of her ghost stories, designed to pass the time and perhaps frighten the more gullible boarders. Mrs. Dalton did love her supernatural tales. "But here is the strange part," she said, her eyes widening dramatically. "They have lowered the price to £1, 1 single pound for a manor house and 50 acres of land. Can you imagine? They just want to be rid of it." They would probably give it away for free if they could find a way to do so without admitting defeat. Something stirred in my chest then, something I had not felt in months. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just desperation dressed in prettier clothes. But whatever it was, it made me sit up straighter, made me pay attention in a way I had not since losing my position. £1, I repeated, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. £1, she confirmed, with evident satisfaction at having finally captured my interest. Of course, the place is a complete ruin. Roof falling in, walls crumbling, gardens gone completely wild. It would cost a fortune to repair, more money than most people have in a lifetime. But still, £1 for a manor house. It makes you wonder what is really wrong with the place, what secrets it might be hiding. I could not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed, wrapped in every blanket I owned against the February cold, my mind racing with calculations and possibilities. I had exactly £4.07 to my name, the last of my savings from 17 years of faithful service. Enough to buy the manor 3 times over, with money left for food. But what would I do with a ruined house in Yorkshire? What could a governess with no family, no connections, and no prospects possibly do with 50 acres of cursed land? And yet, the idea would not leave me. It burrowed into my thoughts like a seed taking root in frozen ground, refusing to be dislodged no matter how many times I told myself it was madness. For the first time in my entire life, I could own something. I could have a place that was mine, truly mine, not borrowed or rented or given at the pleasure of an employer who could dismiss me at any moment. Even if it was a ruin, even if it was haunted, even if every sensible person in England thought I had lost my mind, it would be mine. I wrote to the government office handling the sale the very next morning, before I could lose my nerve. My letter was brief and businesslike, inquiring about the property and the terms of sale. Within a week, I had received a response confirming that Ashford Hall was indeed available for purchase at the price of £1. The letter was short and to the point, with a tone that suggested they were as eager to be rid of the property as Mrs. Dalton had claimed. There were no conditions attached, no requirements for repair or habitation or improvement. I would own it outright, free and clear, to do with as I pleased. I signed the papers on the 1st of March, 1879, in a cold government office in Whitehall, surrounded by clerks who looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "Why would anyone want that place?" one of them muttered to another as I added my signature to the deed. "She must be mad." Perhaps I was. Perhaps desperation and loneliness had driven me to the edge of sanity. But as I walked out of that office with the deed clutched in my hand, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt alive. 2 weeks later, I boarded a train to Yorkshire with everything I owned packed into a single trunk. The journey north was long and gray, the landscape outside my window growing wilder and more desolate with each passing mile. Rolling green hills gave way to stark, windswept moors, where the heather had not yet begun to bloom. The sky hung low and heavy with the promise of rain, and the few villages we passed through looked huddled and weary, as if beaten down by centuries of harsh weather. I watched the world pass by through the smudged window of my third-class carriage, surrounded by farmers and laborers who paid me no attention, and I wondered, not for the first time, if I had made a terrible mistake. The village nearest to Ashford Hall was called Thornfield, a small collection of grey stone buildings huddled together at the edge of the moors, as if for warmth against the relentless wind. The train station was little more than a wooden platform with a small shelter, and when I stepped off the train with my trunk, I was immediately struck by the silence. After months in London, with its constant noise and bustle, the quiet of Thornfield was almost overwhelming. I could hear the wind whistling across the moors, the distant bleating of sheep, and nothing else. The station master, an elderly man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, emerged from the shelter and looked me up and down with undisguised curiosity. "You will be the new owner of the hall then," he said. It was not a question. Word travels fast, I observed, pulling my traveling cloak more tightly around my shoulders against the biting wind. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Not much else to talk about around here. A stranger buying the haunted manor is the most exciting thing that has happened in Thornfield in 20 years. He paused, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You know what they say about that place. I have heard the stories." "Stories," he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "Some would call them warnings, miss. But I suppose you will find out for yourself soon enough. Cannot say I envy you, spending a night in that house. Cannot say I envy you at all." He directed me to a man named Hobson who owned a cart and horse and made a modest living transporting goods and occasional passengers to the outlying farms and estates. Hobson was a taciturn fellow with a face like carved granite who spoke perhaps 10 words during the entire journey, and most of those were directed at his horse. But I did not mind the silence. It gave me time to prepare myself for what lay ahead, to steel my nerves against whatever I might find. We crested a hill just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, and there it was, Ashford Hall. Even in its ruined state, it took my breath away. The manor rose from the moorland like a ship emerging from fog, its towers and chimneys silhouetted against the burning sky. It was built of gray stone that had darkened with age to nearly black in places, its windows like empty eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. Ivy had conquered the eastern wing entirely, crawling up the walls and over the roof like a living shroud, its tendrils reaching toward the chimneys, as if trying to pull the whole structure back down into the earth. The gardens, if they could still be called that, had long since surrendered to wildness, and the iron gates that marked the entrance to the drive hung crooked on their rusted hinges, groaning in the wind like wounded animals. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It was mine. Hobson stopped the cart at the gate and refused to go any further, no matter how much I offered to pay him. His face had gone pale beneath its weathering, and his eyes kept darting toward the house as if he expected something to emerge from it at any moment. "I will not set foot on that land," he said, and his voice had lost its gruffness, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "Not for any amount of money. You can walk from here. It is not far." I did not press him. I could see that his terror was genuine, and I had no desire to force a confrontation. I paid him the few coins we had agreed upon, retrieved my trunk from the back of the cart, and watched him drive away without looking back, urging his horse to a speed that seemed almost dangerous on the rutted road. Then I turned to face my new home. The walk up the overgrown drive took nearly 20 minutes, dragging my trunk behind me through the tangled weeds and fallen branches. The gravel that had once lined the path had long since been swallowed by the earth, and I had to pick my way carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on the uneven ground. By the time I reached the front door, a massive oak portal that had once been painted black but was now faded to a streaky gray. The last light was fading from the sky, and I was cold, tired, hungry, and beginning to question every decision I had ever made. The door was unlocked. It swung open at my touch with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house, the sound bouncing off walls and ceilings I could not yet see. I stepped inside and found myself in a grand entrance hall, its marble floors thick with decades of dust, its once magnificent chandelier draped in cobwebs that swayed gently in the draught from the open door. A grand staircase curved upward into darkness, its banister carved with intricate designs that I could barely make out in the fading light. On either side of the hall, doorways led to rooms I could not yet see, their interiors lost in shadow. I stood there for a long moment, barely breathing, listening. The house was silent except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of settling wood. Sounds that could have been anything, could have been nothing. No voices, no shadows moving where they should not. Just emptiness and dust and the faint smell of decay. "I am home," I said aloud, and the words felt strange on my tongue, almost foreign, I had never had a home before. Not really. Not since my father died, and our little cottage in Dorset became just another place I was allowed to exist temporarily. But this place, this ruin, was mine now, truly mine, and I would make of it what I could. That first night, I slept in the entrance hall, wrapped in my traveling cloak, with my trunk serving as a pillow, and my back pressed against the cold marble wall. I was too exhausted to explore further, too cold to search for a proper bed in the darkness that had fallen over the house like a shroud. I had no candles, no lamp, nothing but the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. But despite my discomfort, despite the strangeness of my surroundings, I slept more peacefully than I had in months. There was something about the silence of the house, the absolute stillness of it, that felt almost protective, as if the walls themselves were keeping watch over me, welcoming me home. I woke with the dawn, stiff and sore and shivering with cold, but filled with a determination I had not felt in years. I had work to do, a lifetime's worth of work perhaps, but for the first time that work would be for myself. I spent the first week simply exploring the manor, mapping its rooms and corridors, assessing the damage and cataloging what could be salvaged. The house was larger than I had expected, with over 40 rooms spread across 3 floors and 2 wings. The east wing, where the ivy had taken hold, was largely uninhabitable. Its roof collapsed in several places, letting in rain and wind, its walls slick with damp and spotted with mold. The plaster had crumbled away from the walls, revealing the bare stone beneath, and in some rooms the floorboards had rotted through entirely, leaving gaping holes that dropped into darkness below. I would not venture into that wing more than necessary, I decided. It was too dangerous, and there was plenty of work to be done elsewhere. But the west wing was in surprisingly better condition. The roof was intact, the windows, though dirty, were unbroken, and the walls seemed solid enough. I established my living quarters there, in a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor that had once belonged to a lady of the house. The furniture that remained was old but solid, covered in dusty sheets that I removed one by one, revealing treasures beneath. A 4-poster bed with velvet hangings that had faded from what must once have been a deep crimson to a soft rose pink. A writing desk of polished mahogany, its surface scratched but still elegant. A wardrobe large enough to hold 3 times as many clothes as I possessed. A mirror in a gilded frame that reflected my face back at me, older and more tired than I remembered, but alive, still alive. I cleaned obsessively during those first weeks, scrubbing floors and washing windows and beating carpets until my arms ached and my back screamed for mercy. I found a well behind the house that still produced clean, clear water, cold as ice and tasting faintly of minerals. I discovered a kitchen garden so overgrown I could barely identify the herbs and vegetables that had once grown there. But I found some remnants of parsley and thyme and sage, hardy plants that had survived the years of neglect. I learned to light fires in the ancient fireplaces without filling the rooms with smoke, a skill that took several attempts and much coughing to master. I learned which floorboards creaked and which stairs were too rotten to trust, which doors stuck and which windows rattled in the wind. And slowly, gradually, Ashford Hall began to feel less like a ruin and more like a refuge. The dust retreated room by room, the windows cleared to let in pale northern light. The fireplaces roared with warmth that drove back the damp chill that had settled into my bones. I was still alone, still isolated, still uncertain of my future, but I was no longer afraid. It was during my 3rd week in the manor that I found the library. I had explored most of the West Wing by then, had mapped its rooms and passageways and peculiarities. But there was one door on the ground floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with faded portraits, that had resisted all my attempts to open it. The lock was rusted shut, seized solid with decades of disuse, and no amount of oil or force could persuade it to yield. I had tried everything I could think of, had bruised my shoulder throwing myself against the door, had broken 2 hairpins attempting to pick the lock. I had nearly given up on it entirely when I discovered a set of keys hidden in a secret compartment in the writing desk in my room. The compartment was cleverly concealed, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press, and I found it only by accident when I was dusting the desk and my fingers slipped into a groove I had not noticed before. Among the keys was one that fit the library door perfectly. It turned in the lock with a satisfying click, and the door swung open as if it had been waiting all those years for someone to find the right key. The room that lay beyond took my breath away. It was enormous, stretching the entire length of the wing, with windows that rose from floor to ceiling and bookshelves that climbed to heights I could not reach without a ladder. Thousands of books lined those shelves, their spines faded and dusty but intact, row upon row of leather-bound volumes in every size and color imaginable. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with scenes of Greek mythology, heroes and gods, and monsters frozen in stone. And above it hung a portrait of a woman in a white gown, her dark hair piled elegantly atop her head, her expression serene and knowing. I stood before that portrait for a long time, wondering who she was. A previous owner of the house, perhaps, a wife or daughter of the baron who had lost everything. She was beautiful in the way that aristocratic women often were in old paintings, polished and remote, her beauty almost intimidating in its perfection. But there was something in her dark eyes that suggested hidden depths. Secrets, perhaps, or sorrows that she had learned to conceal behind that serene expression. It was not until I began to examine the library more closely that I discovered the hidden room. I was searching for a book on household management, something practical that might help me in my efforts to restore the manor, when I noticed that one section of the shelving seemed slightly out of alignment with the rest. The books there were dustier than elsewhere, as if they had not been touched in decades, perhaps longer. When I pulled one from the shelf to examine it, I heard a faint click, like the sound of a mechanism engaging. The entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a doorway that had been completely invisible before. My heart was pounding as I stepped through, my candle held high to illuminate the darkness beyond. The room I found was small, no larger than a closet, and completely windowless. The air was stale and cold, and I could see my breath misting in the candlelight. But what the room contained made me gasp aloud. A trunk. An old wooden trunk, its brass fittings green with age, its lid sealed with a lock that crumbled to dust at my touch, the metal so corroded it offered no resistance at all. And inside, wrapped in velvet that had once been royal purple but had faded to a dusty gray, were treasures beyond anything I could have imagined. Letters. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, tied with ribbon that had once been red, their wax seals bearing a crest I recognized at once. The royal crest. The seal of Queen Victoria herself. Jewelry. A necklace of pearls and sapphires. Each gem flawless and perfectly matched. A bracelet of diamonds that caught the candlelight and threw rainbows onto the stone walls. A ring with a ruby the size of my thumbnail, set in gold so pure it seemed to glow. Each piece was exquisite, the craftsmanship unmistakable. These were not mere trinkets bought from some London shop. They were heirlooms, royal heirlooms, and at the bottom of the trunk, beneath the letters and the jewels, a document. A confession, written in a hand that trembled with emotion, the ink faded but still legible, signed with a name I knew from history books and newspapers and the coins in my pocket. Victoria R. I read that confession by candlelight, sitting on the cold stone floor of the hidden room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. And as I read, the history I thought I knew crumbled away, replaced by something far more human, far more tragic, far more real. The Queen, it seemed, had not always been the stern and proper monarch the world believed her to be. In her youth, before her marriage to Prince Albert, before she became the widow in eternal mourning that the nation now revered, she had fallen in love. Not with a prince or a duke or an earl, not with anyone the court would have approved of, but with a musician. A Scottish violinist named Callum Brennan, who had been invited to perform at a private concert at the palace. He had played a piece by Mendelssohn, she wrote, and when he lifted his bow from the strings, I knew that I was lost. Their affair had been brief but passionate, conducted in secret during stolen moments, hidden from the watchful eyes of the court. They had met in gardens and empty hallways, had exchanged letters through trusted servants, had loved each other with the desperate intensity of youth. And from that affair, a child had been born. A son, a boy who could never be acknowledged, never be claimed, never be allowed to exist in the official record of the crown. The confession spoke of heartbreak and sacrifice, of a young queen forced to give up her child to protect her throne and her reputation. To keep him was impossible, she wrote. To lose him was death. But I chose my duty as I always must, and I have never forgiven myself. The boy had been sent away, entrusted to a family who would raise him in secret, far from London and the prying eyes of society. He had been given the name Edward Ashford, and he had been brought to this very manor to be hidden from the world. The letters in the trunk were from the Queen to her son, written over the course of decades. Some were formal, distant, the carefully worded letters of a monarch to a subject. But others were intimate, tender, filled with the love of a mother who had never stopped grieving for the child she had been forced to abandon. She wrote of her pride in his accomplishments, her sorrow at his struggles, her desperate wish that things could have been different. She wrote of watching him from afar, of receiving reports of his health and happiness, of treasuring every scrap of information that her agents could provide. And the jewelry, I realized as I sat there surrounded by centuries of secrets, was his inheritance. A fortune in gems that the Queen had secretly set aside for the son she could never publicly acknowledge. A fortune that had been hidden here in this forgotten manor, waiting for someone to find it. I sat among those treasures until the candle burned down to nothing and I was left in darkness, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had discovered. This was not merely valuable, this was history. A scandal that could shake the monarchy to its foundations, that could rewrite everything the world believed about Queen Victoria and her reign. And it was mine. All of it. The letters, the jewels, the terrible, beautiful truth of it. Mine by right of purchase, mine by right of discovery. But what was I to do with it? I did not sleep that night. I could not. I paced the library floor until my legs ached. The confession clutched in my hands, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. What was I to do with this knowledge? Who was I to hold such secrets? Was it my right to reveal them, or my duty to keep them hidden? And what would happen to me if anyone discovered what I had found? I was still pacing when the sun rose, still wrestling with my thoughts, when I heard the sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats on the drive. The sound of a horse approaching at speed, its rider pushing it hard. And then, a pounding at the door that echoed through the empty house like thunder. I hid the trunk's contents as quickly as I could, stuffing them into a drawer of the writing desk and covering them with papers. My heart was racing as I made my way to the entrance hall, as I pulled open the heavy front door to face whoever had come. He stood on the threshold like a storm given human form. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale gray and cold as ice. His jaw was set with a tension that suggested barely contained fury, and his riding clothes were dusty from hard travel. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze the very air between us. "I am Lord Theodore Ashford," he said, "and you are trespassing on my property." I stared at him, this man who had appeared from nowhere with claims that threatened to undo everything I had built. He was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and hard lines, but there was nothing soft or welcoming in his expression. He looked at me the way one might look at an insect that had wandered into the parlor. "Your property," I repeated, drawing myself up to my full height, which was still considerably less than his. "I beg your pardon, sir. But this manor belongs to me. I purchased it legally from the crown 3 weeks ago. Something flickered in those gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. He had not expected me to answer back, I realized. He had expected me to cower and apologize and run away. The thought gave me a strange satisfaction. The crown had no right to sell what was never theirs to take, he said, his voice growing colder still. This house belonged to my family for 3 generations before it was seized. My great-grandfather was falsely accused of treason, his lands and titles stripped from him on the word of men who coveted what was his. I have spent 10 years gathering the evidence to prove his innocence, and I have finally succeeded. The courts have agreed to hear my case, and when I win, and I will win, this manor will be returned to its rightful owners. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, felt the fragile foundation of my new life beginning to crack. But I refused to let my fear show. I had spent too many years being overlooked and dismissed to surrender now. Until the courts rule otherwise, I am the legal owner of Ashford Hall. I will not be bullied or intimidated by threats and accusations. He took a step closer, close enough that I could see the individual striations of color in his eyes. The pale gray shot through with threads of silver and blue. He was trying to overwhelm me, I realized, trying to use his size and his title and his aristocratic arrogance to make me cower and retreat. But I had spent my entire life being overlooked and underestimated by men who thought they knew better. I had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to stand my ground. I am not threatening you, miss. He paused, waiting for me to supply my name, his tone making it clear that he considered the request a condescension. Wentworth. Miss Cecily Wentworth. Miss Wentworth. He said my name as if it were something distasteful, something far beneath his notice. I am simply informing you of the facts. This property will be mine again within the year. You would be wise to make other arrangements. And you would be wise, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands, the racing of my heart, not to underestimate me. I have nowhere else to go, Lord Ashford. This is my home now, and I will not surrender it without a fight. For a long moment, we simply stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him like a physical force, could see the tension in the set of his shoulders and the clench of his jaw. He was not accustomed to being defied, that much was clear. Men of his station never were. They were raised to believe that the world existed to serve them, that their wishes were commands, that anyone who opposed them was either a fool or an enemy. But there was something else in his gaze as well, something that flickered beneath the ice. It looked almost like curiosity, as if I had surprised him, and he was not entirely certain how to respond. Very well, he said at last, after a silence that seemed to stretch for hours. If you insist on remaining, I cannot force you to leave. Yet. But I will be staying in the village until my case is heard. And I will be watching, Miss Wentworth. Do not think you can strip this house of its remaining value while I am not looking. I have no intention of stripping anything, I replied, my temper flaring despite my best efforts to remain calm. I came here to make a home, not to plunder, and I would appreciate it if you would refrain from treating me like a common thief. Something shifted in his expression then, a softening perhaps, or maybe just surprise at being spoken to so directly. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he simply nodded once, curtly, turned on his heel, and strode back to his waiting horse. I watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast expanse of the moors, my heart still pounding, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man who claimed my home as his own? What evidence did he have to support his case? And what would happen to me if the courts ruled in his favor? I had no answers. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not give up Ashford Hall without a fight. Not now. Not when I had finally found a place where I might belong. Not when I had discovered secrets that might change everything. The days that followed were tense and uncertain. I threw myself into the work of restoring the manor, partly to distract myself from my worries and partly to prove to Lord Ashford that I was serious about making this place my home. I hired a local woman named Mrs. Bramwell to help with the cleaning and cooking, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had lived in Thornfield her entire life and knew every story, true or otherwise, about Ashford Hall. She is not afraid of the place, she told me on her first day, as we worked together to scrub the kitchen floor. Most folk around here would not set foot in the hall for any amount of money. But I have never been one to believe in ghosts. The only spirits I fear are the ones that come in bottles. I liked her immediately. There was something refreshing about her bluntness, her refusal to pretend or dissemble. After years of living among aristocrats who considered honesty a social faux pas, Mrs. Bramwell was like a breath of fresh air. I also engaged a carpenter from the village, a young man named Thomas Finch, to begin repairs on the most damaged sections of the house. He was quiet and hard-working, with clever hands and a talent for coaxing broken things back to life. Within a week, he had repaired the roof in 3 places, replaced a dozen rotted floorboards, and restored the front gate to working order. But even as I worked, I could not stop thinking about the trunk and its contents. The letters and the jewels haunted my dreams, and I found myself returning to the hidden room again and again, reading and rereading the Queen's Confession, trying to understand what I should do with this knowledge. Part of me wanted to take the jewels to London, to sell them and use the money to secure my future. A fortune in gems would make me independent for life, would free me from the uncertainty that had always defined my existence. I could travel, could buy a modest house somewhere far from here, could live out my days in comfort and security. The thought was tempting, almost irresistible, but another part of me recoiled at the idea. These were not mere trinkets to be sold for profit. They were a mother's legacy to her lost son, a tangible expression of love that had been forced to hide itself away from the world. To sell them felt like a betrayal of that love, a desecration of something sacred. And then there were the letters themselves. What would happen if the world learned the truth about Queen Victoria's secret child? Would it matter after all these years? The Queen was old now, her reign nearing its end. Prince Albert had been dead for nearly 2 decades. Would this revelation destroy her legacy, turn the nation against her? Or would it humanize her, show the world that even monarchs could love and grieve and make terrible sacrifices? I did not know, and so I did nothing. I kept the trunk hidden, kept its secrets to myself, and tried to focus on the work at hand. Lord Ashford returned a week after our first encounter. He did not knock this time, did not announce himself at the door. He simply appeared in the garden where I was attempting to restore some semblance of order to the overgrown roses, his tall figure casting a shadow over my work. "Miss Wentworth," he said, and his voice was different this time. Less cold, though still distant. "I find myself in need of information about the manor's current state. The courts will require an assessment before they can rule on my claim. I thought perhaps you might be willing to show me what you have discovered during your time here." I sat back on my heels, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my apron. "You mean you want me to help you take my home away from me?" "I mean nothing of the sort." His jaw tightened, but he did not rise to my provocation. "I am simply trying to understand what has become of my family's estate. Surely you can appreciate that." I studied him for a long moment, this proud and difficult man. In the daylight, without the fury of our first meeting coloring everything, I could see details I had missed before. The lines of exhaustion around his eyes, as if he had not slept well in a very long time. The faint gray at his temples that suggested years of stress and worry. The way his hands curled into fists at his sides, as if he were fighting a constant battle to keep his emotions in check. He was not simply a wealthy aristocrat seeking to reclaim his property. He was a man haunted by the past, driven by a need to right a wrong that had shaped his entire life. I recognized that kind of determination. I saw it in my own mirror every morning. "Very well," I said, rising to my feet and brushing the soil from my skirts. "I will show you the manor, but I want something in return." His eyebrows lifted, skepticism clear in his expression. "And what would that be?" "The truth. I want to know what really happened to your family. Not the official story, not the version sanitized for polite society. The truth." For a moment, I thought he would refuse. His expression shuddered, closed off, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant moors. But then he nodded, once, sharply. "The truth, then. Though I warn you, Miss Wentworth, it is not a pleasant tale." I led him through the manor, room by room, showing him the progress I had made and the work that still remained. He said little as we walked, but I could see him taking in every detail, his eyes moving over the walls and floors with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something. Memories, perhaps, or ghosts of a different kind. He stopped frequently to touch things: a carved banister, a faded portrait, a crack in the plaster that had been there, he said quietly, since he was a child. He had visited this house once, he told me, when he was very young. His father had brought him here in secret, had shown him the home that should have been his birthright. He remembered very little of that visit, but he remembered the feeling, the sense of something lost, something stolen, something that could never be recovered. It was when we reached the library that he finally spoke at length. "This was my great-grandfather's favorite room," he said, his voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "He was a scholar, you know, a historian. He spent decades researching the true history of the English monarchy, the secrets that were never written in the official records." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of secrets?" Lord Ashford moved to the window, his back to me, his silhouette dark against the gray light. The kind that could destroy reputations, end careers, perhaps even topple thrones. He had evidence, Miss Wentworth. Evidence of things that powerful people wanted kept hidden. And when he refused to destroy that evidence, they destroyed him instead. "The treason charges," I said. He turned to face me, and I saw the pain in his eyes, raw and unguarded, stripped of all the armor he usually wore. There was no treason. My great-grandfather was the most loyal subject the crown ever had, but he knew too much, and he would not be silenced. So they silenced him another way. They took everything he had, branded him a traitor, and left his family to live in shame and poverty for generations. I thought of the trunk hidden in the secret room, of the letters and jewels, and the confession that could prove everything Lord Ashford was saying. The Queen's secret child would have been his great-grandfather's contemporary. Was it possible that the two stories were connected? That the Baron had been destroyed not for any crime of his own, but because he had learned the truth about the Queen's illegitimate son? "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it with all my heart. No one should have to carry that kind of burden. Something in his expression shifted. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, as if I had suddenly become a person rather than an obstacle. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "A fortune hunter, a schemer, someone who saw an opportunity and seized it without thought for the consequences." I shook my head. "I am just a woman who had nowhere else to go. I bought this house because it was all I could afford, and because I was tired of living at the mercy of others. I did not come here to steal anything, Lord Ashford. I came here to survive." He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you." It was such a small thing, those 3 words, but they felt like a victory nonetheless. I had been dismissed and doubted for so long that the simple acknowledgement of my honesty made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. We finished our tour of the manor as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty floors. At the door, Lord Ashford paused. "I have taken rooms at the inn in Thornfield," he said. "I will be there for the foreseeable future, until the courts make their decision. If you need anything, If there is trouble of any kind, you may send word to me there." I raised an eyebrow. "I thought you wanted me gone." "I want the truth," he replied, his voice quiet but intense. "And I am beginning to think that perhaps we want the same thing." He left without another word, and I stood in the doorway, watching him ride away until he disappeared over the crest of the hill, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The weeks that followed were strange and unexpected. Lord Ashford returned to the manor almost daily, ostensibly to continue his inspection of the property, but increasingly his visits became something else. Conversations, long, wandering discussions about history and politics and philosophy, about the nature of justice and the weight of secrets. He was educated and articulate, with a mind that moved in fascinating directions, and I found myself looking forward to his visits in a way that troubled me deeply. He was still my adversary after all. His legal case could still cost me everything I had worked for. And yet, somehow, in the space between arguments and agreements, something had begun to grow. Something fragile and unnamed, but undeniably present. We took to walking together in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the light was soft and golden on the moors. He told me about his life, about the years he had spent in obscurity, working as a clerk in a shipping company while secretly gathering evidence to clear his family's name. He told me about his mother, who had died when he was young, and his father, who had died only 5 years ago, still bitter, still broken by the injustice that had defined his existence. And I told him about myself, about my years of service, my loneliness, my desperate hunger for a place to belong, about my mother and my father, about the childhood I had lost and the adulthood I had endured, about the dreams I had once had, before I learned that dreams were luxuries I could not afford. We were two wounded creatures, I realized, circling each other warily, drawn together by our shared pain, but afraid to trust too completely. He had been betrayed by the world he was born into. I had been ignored by it. And yet, somehow, we understood each other in a way that no one else ever had. I did not tell him about the trunk, not yet. I told myself I was protecting myself, protecting my claim to the house and its contents. But the truth was more complicated than that. I was afraid of what would happen when he learned the truth, afraid that he would see me as his enemies had seen his great-grandfather, as someone who knew too much and could not be trusted, afraid that the fragile thing growing between us would shatter like glass. It was Mrs. Bramwell who first noticed the change in my demeanor. She was a sharp-eyed woman, Mrs. Bramwell, with a gift for seeing through pretense that made her both invaluable and slightly terrifying. "You have feelings for him," she said one morning, as I was attempting to catalogue the books in the library. "Lord Ashford, you are falling in love with him. I nearly dropped the volume I was holding. That is absurd. He is trying to take my home. He is a man who has suffered greatly," she replied calmly, not looking up from the silver she was polishing. "And you are a woman who has suffered greatly. It is natural that you should recognize something of yourself in each other." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words would not come. Because she was right, of course. I did see myself in Theodore Ashford, in his determination and his pain, and his stubborn refusal to surrender to a world that had treated him unfairly. And I did feel something for him, something that grew stronger with each passing day, despite my best efforts to ignore it. But what could come of such feelings? He was a lord, or would be once his case was decided, and I was a governess. He was fighting to reclaim his family's legacy, and I was fighting to keep what little I had. Even if the courts ruled in my favor, even if I managed to hold on to Ashford Hall, what future could there possibly be for the two of us? I threw myself into work with renewed fervor, trying to drown my confused emotions in physical labor. I cleaned rooms that did not need cleaning. I organized books that were already organized. I spent hours in the garden, pulling weeds and pruning roses until my hands were raw and bleeding. And still, I could not stop thinking about him. It was during one of these frantic sessions of distraction that I made another discovery. I was dusting the portrait above the fireplace in the library, the painting of the woman in the white gown, when I noticed something strange. The canvas seemed thicker in one corner than in the others, as if something had been hidden behind it. Carefully, I removed the painting from the wall, and there, tucked between the canvas and the frame, was a letter. Not one of the Queen's letters, but something different, something personal. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top made me gasp aloud. "My dearest Edward," it began. I read the letter standing there in the dusty library, the portrait propped against the wall beside me, my heart pounding with each word. It was from a woman named Margaret Ashford, the wife of the Baron who had been accused of treason. And it told a story I had not expected. Edward Ashford, the Queen's secret son, had been raised by the Baron and his wife as their own child. They had known from the beginning who he really was, had been entrusted with his care by the Queen herself. They had loved him as their son, and he had loved them as his parents, and for many years they had lived in happiness and secrecy. But the Baron had been a scholar, as Lord Theodore had told me. He had spent his life researching the hidden histories of the English monarchy, and in the course of his research he had discovered the truth about the child he had raised, had found evidence that confirmed Edward's royal parentage beyond any doubt. He had made the terrible mistake of sharing this discovery with a friend at court, a friend who had betrayed him to the Queen's advisors. And those advisors, terrified of what might happen if the truth were ever revealed, had arranged for the Baron to be accused of treason and stripped of everything he owned. The letter was Margaret's final words to the son she had raised, written just before she died of a broken heart. She told him the truth about his birth, about his biological mother, about the reasons for his family's downfall. She begged his forgiveness for the secrets she had kept, and she urged him to find the evidence his father had hidden, the proof that could clear the Ashford name and restore their family's honor. I understood then why the trunk had been hidden so carefully, why the secret room had been built. Edward had found it, had gathered the evidence his father had collected, had added his mother's letter and the Queen's confession and the jewels she had given him. And he had sealed it all away, waiting for a day when the truth could finally be told without destroying anyone. But that day had never come. Edward had died without heirs, the last of the Ashford line, or so everyone had believed. I thought of Lord Theodore, of his determination to clear his family's name. He did not know. He did not know that the evidence he had spent 10 years gathering was here, in this house, hidden behind a false wall in the library. He did not know that he was descended from a queen's illegitimate son, that royal blood ran in his veins. I had to tell him. I knew that now with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Whatever the consequences, whatever it might mean for my claim to the manor, he deserved to know the truth. I sent a message to the inn in Thornfield that same afternoon, and when Lord Theodore arrived at the manor an hour later, his face tense with concern, I led him to the library without a word. "There is something you need to see," I said, "something that will change everything." I showed him the hidden room. I showed him the trunk and its contents. I watched his face as he read the letters, as he held the jewels in his trembling hands, as he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what I had discovered. And then I showed him Margaret's letter, the letter that connected all the pieces, that revealed the true history of his family and his lineage. He was silent for a very long time after he finished reading. He sat on the floor of the hidden room, surrounded by centuries of secrets, and he did not move or speak. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer some word of comfort, but I did not know what to say. What words could possibly be adequate in the face of such a revelation? Finally, he looked up at me. His gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You could have kept this from me," he said. His voice was hoarse, strained with emotion. "You could have sold the jewels, taken the fortune, and I never would have known. Why did you show me?" "Because you deserve to know," I replied. "Because the truth matters. because I know what it is like to have your entire life defined by secrets and lies, and I would not wish that on anyone." He rose to his feet slowly, as if the weight of his new knowledge had made him physically heavier. He crossed the small room until he was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the individual striations of color in his eyes. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "Do you know that? I came here expecting to find an enemy, and instead I found—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I do not know what I found." "Neither do I admitted. "But I am glad it was you who came. I am glad it was not someone else." We stood there for a long moment, suspended in a silence that felt charged with possibility. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took my hand. His touch was warm, gentle, nothing like the cold arrogance he had displayed when we first met. I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been sealed away for so long, I had forgotten it existed. "What happens now?" he asked, "with the letters, with the jewels, with all of this?" "I do not know," I said honestly. "We will have to decide together, I suppose." Together. He repeated the word as if testing its weight. "Yes, I think I would like that." The weeks that followed were unlike any I had ever experienced. Lord Theodore and I pored over the contents of the trunk together, reading every letter, examining every piece of jewelry, piecing together the hidden history of his family. We debated what to do with the evidence, whether to make it public or keep it hidden, whether the Queen's secret deserved to be revealed after all these years. In the end, we decided to do nothing. Not yet. The Queen was old and ailing, and we agreed that there was no need to cause her further pain in her final years. The truth would still be there when she was gone. The evidence would still exist, and when the time was right, we would decide together how to share it with the world. But the process of reaching that decision brought us closer than I ever could have imagined. In those long evenings in the library, by the light of candles and the heat of the fire, I came to know Theodore Ashford in a way I had never known another person. I learned his fears and his hopes, his regrets and his dreams. I learned that beneath his cold exterior was a heart that had been wounded too many times, that his arrogance was a shield he had built to protect himself from further hurt. And he learned me in return. He learned about my years of service, my loneliness, my desperate hunger for a place to belong. He learned about my mother and my father, about the childhood I had lost and the adulthood I had endured. He learned that I was stronger than I appeared and more vulnerable than I would ever admit. We fell in love slowly, carefully, the way two wounded creatures circle each other before daring to draw close. There were moments of doubt and fear, moments when old habits of self-protection reasserted themselves and we retreated to our separate corners. But always, inevitably, we found our way back to each other. It was Theodore who first spoke the words aloud. We were sitting in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the moors, the sky blazing with color, when he turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It was open, unguarded, completely without defenses. "I love you, Cecily," he said. "I have tried not to. I have told myself 1,000 reasons why I should not. But I love you nonetheless, and I cannot pretend otherwise any longer." I felt something break open in my chest, something that had been locked away for so long I had forgotten it existed. "Theodore," I whispered, "I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first day when you stood on my doorstep and demanded I leave. I thought you were the most arrogant, insufferable man I had ever met, and I could not stop thinking about you." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh that transformed his face and made him look younger, lighter. I believe the feeling was mutual. You were the most stubborn, infuriating woman I had ever encountered. And you were magnificent. He kissed me then, for the first time. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a statement. But I answered it with everything I had, with all the years of loneliness and longing that had built up inside me. And when we finally drew apart, I knew that my life had changed forever. The legal case that had brought Theodore to Thornfield was resolved a month later. He had gathered enough evidence to prove that his great-grandfather had been falsely accused, that the treason charges had been manufactured by enemies at court. The family's name was officially cleared, their titles restored. But when the courts offered to return Ashford Hall to his possession, Theodore declined. He told them that the manor already belonged to someone who had brought it back to life and made it a home. Someone he intended to marry, if she would have him. I said yes, of course. I said yes with tears streaming down my face, with joy and disbelief, and a love so overwhelming I could barely breathe. I had spent my entire life being invisible, being overlooked, being nothing more than a function to be used and discarded. And now this man, this proud and wounded and remarkable man, wanted me to be his wife. We were married in the spring of 1880 in the small church in Thornfield. Mrs. Bramwell wept throughout the entire ceremony, and Hobson, the taciturn cart driver who had brought me to the manor a year before, actually smiled. The villagers who had once whispered about the haunted house on the moors now spoke of Lady Ashford, the governess who had bought a ruin for £1 and found a fortune in love. Theodore and I worked together to restore Ashford Hall to its former glory. We repaired the roof and replaced the windows, we cleared the gardens and replanted the roses. We opened the rooms that had been closed for decades and filled them with light and warmth and laughter. And in the library, behind the false wall, we kept the trunk and its secrets, waiting for the day when the truth could finally be told. That day came sooner than we expected. In January of 1901, Queen Victoria died. The entire nation mourned, and the world, as we had known, it seemed to shift on its axis. A new king sat on the throne. A new century stretched out before us, and Theodore and I found ourselves facing a decision we had put off for over 20 years. We had added to the trunk over the years. We had gathered more evidence, more letters, more documentation of the secret history we had uncovered. And we had written our own account of everything we had discovered, a careful and thorough record of the truth. It was time to share it with the world. We approached a historian Theodore had known at Oxford, a man of impeccable reputation and scholarly integrity. We gave him access to everything we had collected. He spent months verifying the evidence, confirming its authenticity, preparing a scholarly account that would present the truth without sensationalism or scandal. The book was published in 1903. It caused a sensation, of course. There were those who refused to believe it, who insisted it was a forgery or a hoax. But the evidence was too substantial, too well documented to be dismissed. Slowly, gradually, the truth was accepted. Queen Victoria had loved and lost and made sacrifices that the world had never known. And the Ashford family, maligned and forgotten for generations, had finally been vindicated. The jewels from the trunk were valued at over £1 million. We donated most of them to museums, keeping only a few pieces as family heirlooms. The money we received in exchange went to charity, to schools and hospitals and homes for women who had nowhere else to go. It seemed the right thing to do. It seemed like what Edward Ashford, the Queen's lost son, would have wanted. I am writing this now in the winter of 1910 from the same library where I first discovered the hidden room. I am an old woman, 63 years old, with gray hair and wrinkles and hands that ache from decades of work. But I have lived a life beyond anything I ever imagined possible. I have loved and been loved. I have made a home where none existed. I have held secrets and shared truths and watched history reshape itself around the evidence I uncovered. Theodore is sitting beside me as I write, his hair now fully silver, his face lined with age but still capable of that smile that transforms him. He is reading one of the books from our library, one of the thousands of volumes that fill the shelves from floor to ceiling. Every now and then, he looks up at me, and I see in his eyes the same love that was there on the day he first told me how he felt. I bought a queen's abandoned manor for £1. I expected to find nothing but dust and decay. Instead, I found a fortune in secrets and a love that has sustained me for 30 years. I found a home. I found a family. I found myself. If there is a lesson in my story, I suppose it is this: never underestimate the value of what seems worthless. The manor that no one wanted held treasures beyond imagining. The governess that no one saw became the keeper of history. And the love that seemed impossible became the foundation of everything that followed. I do not know how much longer I have. None of us do. But I know that when my time comes, I will leave this world without regret. I will leave behind a legacy of truth, a family that will carry on after me, and a home that will stand for generations to come. Ashford Hall is no longer a ruin. It is a place of warmth and welcome, of history and hope, and it will always, always be mine. The end of my story is not really an end at all. It is a continuation, a passing of the torch. Theodore and I have no children of our own, but we have made our family in other ways. We have taken in young women like I once was, governesses and maids and factory workers who had nowhere else to go. We have educated them, supported them, helped them build lives of their own. One of them, a girl named Clara, who came to us 10 years ago, has become like a daughter to me. She has Theodore's sharp mind and my stubborn determination, and she will inherit Ashford Hall when we are gone. She will keep our secrets and share our truths, and she will make sure that the world never forgets what we discovered here. I look out the window now, at the gardens I have tended for 3 decades, at the moors that stretch endlessly under the winter sky. I remember the frightened, desperate woman who arrived here with nothing but a single trunk and a refusal to give up. I remember thinking that this ruined house was my last chance, my only hope. I did not know then what I know now. That hope is not a thing you find. It is a thing you make. That home is not a place you buy. It is a place you build. That love is not a dream reserved for others. It is a gift that can find anyone, even a governess with nothing to her name but pride and stubbornness and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. I have been blessed beyond measure, and I am grateful every day for the strange twist of fate that brought me to Ashford Hall, for the courage I did not know I had, for the man who saw me when no one else did, for the secrets that set us both free. My name is Cecily Ashford, once Wentworth. I was born a governess, and I became a lady. I bought a queen's abandoned manor for £1, and what I found inside was worth more than any fortune. It was worth everything. The winter sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Theodore has set aside his book and taken my hand in his. We sit together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade, knowing that whatever comes next, we will face it together. This is my home. This is my love. This is my life. And it is perfect. But perhaps I should tell you more of those middle years, the years between our wedding and the publication of the truth. For it was in those years that I learned what it truly meant to love and be loved, to build a life with another person, to face the world as partners rather than alone. Our first year of marriage was a revelation. I had spent so many years in other people's houses, following other people's rules, existing in the margins of other people's lives, that I hardly knew how to be the mistress of my own home. Theodore was patient with me, endlessly patient, as I learned to give orders rather than take them, to sit at the head of the table rather than eat alone in my room, to speak my mind without fear of dismissal. There were moments when the old fears returned, when I would wake in the night convinced that this happiness was a dream from which I would soon be rudely awakened. Theodore seemed to sense those moments, seemed to know when I needed reassurance. He would reach for me in the darkness, would pull me close and whisper that I was safe, that I was loved, that I was exactly where I belonged. We faced challenges, of course. The restoration of Ashford Hall was more expensive than we had anticipated, and there were months when we worried about money. Theodore's title had been restored, but not his fortune. The wealth that had been stripped from his family generations ago was gone forever, dispersed into the coffers of the crown and the pockets of those who had conspired against the Ashfords. We had the jewels from the trunk, of course, but we were both reluctant to sell them. They were not ours, not really. They belonged to history, to the memory of a queen and her lost son. So we economized. We did much of the work ourselves, Theodore and I, with the help of Mrs. Bramwell and Thomas Finch and a few other loyal souls who had come to care for us as much as we cared for them. We learned to plaster walls and repair windows, to tend gardens and manage livestock. We turned part of the estate into a working farm, selling produce and eggs and milk to the villagers who had once feared to come near the haunted manor. It was hard work, physical work, the kind I had never expected to do. But there was satisfaction in it, a deep and abiding joy that I had never found in teaching French conjugations to aristocratic children. When I stood in my garden at the end of a long day, surveying the neat rows of vegetables and the carefully pruned roses, I felt something I had never felt before. Pride. Pride in what I had built, in what we had built together. The villagers accepted us slowly, grudgingly at first, then with increasing warmth as they came to know us. They had expected Lord Ashford to be like the aristocrats they had known before, cold and distant and contemptuous of common folk. Instead, they found a man who would roll up his sleeves and help repair a broken fence, who would sit in the village pub and listen to their stories, who treated them as equals rather than inferiors. And they had expected me to put on airs, to lord my new title over the women who had once been my peers. Instead, they found a woman who still knew how to scrub a floor and mend a torn dress, who would help nurse a sick child without waiting to be asked, who remembered what it was like to be poor and lonely and afraid. We became part of the community in a way that surprised us both. We attended christenings and weddings and funerals. We donated to the church and the school. We opened our home to village celebrations, filling the great hall with music and laughter and dancing. And slowly, over the years, Ashford Hall lost its reputation for haunting and gained a new reputation instead. It became known as a place of welcome, a place of warmth, a place where anyone in need could find help and comfort. Mrs. Bramwell was instrumental in this transformation. She had lived in Thornfield her entire life, and she knew everyone's secrets, everyone's sorrows, everyone's needs. She became my guide to the complex web of relationships that bound the village together, helping me navigate feuds and alliances that had existed for generations. She taught me which families were proud and which were humble, which could be approached directly and which required delicate handling. She became my closest friend, the sister I had never had, and when she finally passed away in the winter of 1905, I mourned her as deeply as I had mourned my own mother. Thomas Finch married and had children, and his eldest son, young Thomas, grew up playing in the gardens of Ashford Hall, learning the skills of carpentry from his father and the love of books from me. When the time came for him to make his own way in the world, Theodore and I paid for his education, sent him to university, watched with pride as he became a teacher himself. He wrote to us faithfully, letters full of gratitude and affection, and when he named his first daughter Cecily, I wept with joy. These were the small victories of our life together, not the grand revelations of hidden treasures or royal scandals, but the quiet triumphs of human connection. A child educated, a family helped through hard times, a community strengthened by bonds of mutual care and respect. These were the things that gave my life meaning, that made me feel that my existence had purpose beyond mere survival. But there were dark times, too. There were years when the crops failed and we struggled to pay our debts. There were winters so harsh that we feared we would not survive them. There was a terrible fever that swept through the village in 1889, claiming a dozen lives, including 3 children I had taught to read. I sat by their bedsides as they died, held their mothers as they wept, and wondered how a just God could allow such suffering. And there was the constant, gnawing knowledge of what we kept hidden in the secret room. The truth about the Queen's son, about the Ashford family, about the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. We had agreed to wait, to keep silent until the Queen died, but the waiting wore on us both. Theodore would sometimes disappear into the library for hours, poring over the letters and documents, trying to make sense of the injustice that had shaped his family's history. I would find him there late at night, his face drawn and weary, haunted by ghosts he could not lay to rest. I worried about what the revelation would do to us, to our quiet life on the moors. We had built something precious, Theodore and I, something fragile and beautiful. Would it survive the storm that was sure to come when the truth was finally told? Would the world forgive us for keeping silent so long? Would they understand why we had waited, why we had chosen to protect an old woman's reputation rather than shout the truth from the rooftops? I did not know, and so I prayed, something I had not done since childhood. I prayed for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to face whatever was coming. And I held on to Theodore, held on to our love as the years passed and the Queen grew older, and we waited for the moment when history would finally be set right. The news of Victoria's death reached us on a cold January morning, brought by a messenger from London who had ridden through the night. "The Queen is dead," he said, and the words seemed to echo through the frozen air, carrying with them the weight of an era's ending. Theodore and I stood together in the great hall, our breath misting in the cold, and we knew that our time had come. No more waiting, no more hiding. The truth would finally be told. But first, we mourned. Whatever secrets Victoria had kept, whatever sins she had committed, she had been our queen for our entire lives. She had presided over an empire, had shaped the world we lived in, had become a symbol of everything British. Her death was the end of something, the closing of a chapter in the story of our nation. We attended the memorial service in Thornfield's little church, stood with our neighbors as the vicar spoke of duty and sacrifice and eternal rest. We lit candles for her soul, prayed for her peace. And then, when the formal mourning was done, we turned our attention to the task that lay before us. The decision to approach Professor Edmund Whitmore was Theodore's. He was a historian of some renown, a man Theodore had known at Oxford, respected for his integrity and his dedication to truth above all else. If anyone could present our evidence fairly and thoroughly, without sensationalism or scandal-mongering, it was he. We invited him to Ashford Hall in the spring of 1901. He arrived expecting, I think, to humor an old acquaintance with delusions of historical significance. He left 3 days later with his worldview shattered and his scholarly career transformed. I remember the moment he finished reading the Queen's confession. He set the paper down with trembling hands, removed his spectacles, and stared at us with an expression of absolute disbelief. "This cannot be true," he said. "It is impossible. The Queen herself, confessing to an illegitimate child. It defies everything we know about her character, about her reign." "And yet," Theodore replied calmly, "there it is, in her own hand. We have had the handwriting authenticated by 3 separate experts. It is genuine, Professor, every word of it." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Professor Whitmore brought in colleagues to examine the evidence, historians and archivists and handwriting experts who pored over every letter, every document, every piece of jewelry. They questioned us relentlessly, probed for inconsistencies, searched for any sign of forgery or fabrication. They found none. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. The Queen had borne an illegitimate son. That son had been raised by the Ashford family. The Baron had been destroyed for knowing too much, and now, at last, the truth would be revealed. The publication of the book, The Secret History of Victoria Regina, caused an uproar that exceeded even our expectations. Newspapers around the world carried the story. Parliament debated whether the revelations should be suppressed. The new king, Edward VII, summoned Professor Whitmore to an audience at Buckingham Palace and emerged, according to reports, looking pale and shaken. We were at the center of the storm, Theodore and I. Reporters descended on Thornfield, camped outside the gates of Ashford Hall, demanded interviews and photographs and statements. Society figures who had never deigned to acknowledge our existence suddenly sought invitations to our home. And the letters came, hundreds of them, from people who praised us for our courage and people who condemned us for our treachery. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. And yet, beneath it all, there was a profound sense of relief. The secret we had carried for so long was finally out. The truth had been told. Whatever came next, we would face it without the weight of hidden knowledge dragging us down. The controversy eventually faded, as all controversies do. The world moved on to new scandals, new sensations, new causes for outrage. Professor Whitmore's book became required reading for students of Victorian history. The Ashford family's reputation was fully restored, the treason charges officially expunged from the record, and Theodore and I returned to our quiet life on the moors, older and wearier, but at peace. The jewels, as I mentioned, were donated to museums after their value was assessed. £1,000,000, the experts said. Perhaps more. A fortune beyond imagining, beyond anything I had ever dreamed of possessing. We kept a few pieces, personal mementos that we felt had been meant for us. A pearl ring that Victoria had worn in her youth. A sapphire brooch that had belonged to Edward Ashford's biological father, the Scottish violinist whose music had captured a queen's heart. A locket containing a miniature portrait of Victoria herself, painted when she was just a girl, before duty and loss and the weight of a crown had hardened her features. The rest of the money went to charity. It seemed the right thing to do, the only thing to do. We had not earned that wealth. We had simply found it, stumbled upon it in a hidden room in a ruined house. To keep it for ourselves would have felt like theft, like a betrayal of everything we believed in. So we gave it away. We founded schools for children who could not afford education. We established hospitals in underserved communities. We created refuges for women like I had once been, women without family or fortune, women cast out by a world that had no patience for their struggles. We tried, in our small way, to make the world a little bit better than we had found it. And now, at the end of my life, I look back on all of it with wonder. The lonely governess who bought a ruined manor for a single £1, the hidden room and its treasures, the proud lord who became my husband, my partner, my dearest friend, the secrets we kept and the truth we finally told, the love that sustained us through all of it, that sustains us still. I have been asked many times what advice I would give to young women starting out in the world. My answer is always the same. Do not let anyone tell you what you are capable of. Do not let fear or circumstance or the expectations of others define the limits of your dreams. Be bold, be stubborn, be willing to take chances, to risk everything on the possibility of something better. And above all, believe in the value of your own story. Every life has meaning. Every person has worth, even those whom the world considers insignificant. You may be a governess with nothing to your name, a woman without family or fortune or prospects. But you carry within you the potential for greatness, for love, for a life beyond anything you can imagine. I know this because I lived it. I am living proof that the impossible can become possible, that the unwanted can become cherished, that the lost can be found. My name is Cecily Ashford. I was born in poverty and raised in obscurity. I spent the first half of my life as a servant, invisible and unvalued. And then, by the grace of God and a £1 purchase, I found my home, my love, my purpose. I found myself. And that, in the end, is worth more than all the Queen's jewels combined. The candle is burning low now, and my hand grows tired. Theodore has fallen asleep in his chair, the book slipping from his fingers, his face peaceful in the firelight. I should wake him, should help him to bed, should finish this account and put away my pen. But I want to savor this moment a little longer. The warmth of the fire, the smell of old books and wood smoke, the sound of my husband's gentle breathing, the knowledge that I am home, truly home, in the place where I belong. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. That is the nature of life. But tonight, in this quiet hour, everything is perfect. Everything is exactly as it should be. I am Cecily Ashford of Ashford Hall, and this is my story.